I'm Jason Williams, I'm 28 years old, and at my family's Christmas dinner, my own brother opened the door, rolled his eyes, and told me to go ruin someone else's holiday. Before I tell you how my father came bursting out of that same door just 10 minutes later, his face pale with panic and yelling my name, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's good to know I'm not alone in this. The 6-hour drive from Detroit Metro Airport to my hometown of Pinewood, Michigan, is a special kind of purgatory. The farther north you go, the more the landscape flattens, the trees get taller, and the cell service gets patchier. It's a slow-motion retreat from the present. With every mile marker, I could feel the carefully constructed armor of my Seattle life. The promotions, the successful projects, the person I had become, chipping away, revealing the anxious 17-year-old kid underneath. The kid who was never quite good enough. For 3 years, I'd avoided this drive. 3 years of carefully curated distance. But my father's voice on the phone a week ago had a new kind of weariness to it, a fragility that had scared me. Please, Jason, he'd said. It's Christmas. The whole family will be here. We all want you here. We all want you here. I clung to that phrase like a life raft. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe the distance had softened things, created space for them to see me, not the version of me they held in their minds. So I came. I spent a small fortune on a last-minute flight. I sat in the rental car, the heater blasting, and stared at the gifts piled on the passenger seat. Each one was a calculated olive branch. For Dad, a bag of expensive, small-batch coffee from a roaster near my Seattle apartment. He was a coffee snob, and this was a nod to his world from mine. For my mother, Patricia, a cashmere scarf in a soft blue I knew she loved, an offering of warmth, a plea for softness in return. For my sister-in-law, Sarah, a signed copy of a best-selling book by a famous event planner. I'd met the author through a work event, and I thought Sarah, who loved hosting parties, would appreciate the effort. For my 5-year-old niece, Emma, and 3-year-old nephew, Noah, I'd found these beautiful, old-fashioned wooden toys from a craftsman at Pike Place Market. I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home. It was exactly the same. A 2-story colonial that looked like it was pulled from a Christmas card, blazing with light against the deep twilight blue. The big wreath with the red velvet bow was on the door. The plastic snowman, whose carrot nose I'd broken with a hockey puck in 4th grade, still stood guard by the porch steps. Inside, I could see them, silhouettes moving behind the curtains. I could hear the faint, familiar murmur of their laughter, the sound muffled by the glass and the falling snow. For a paralyzing second, I almost put the car in reverse. It wasn't too late. I could just disappear, drive to a hotel, fly back to Seattle in the morning, and pretend this never happened. But then I thought of my dad's voice. We all want you here. Taking a deep, cold breath that burned my lungs, I gathered the presents and walked up the shoveled path. The air smelled of wood smoke and pine. I could hear the scratchy vinyl of Dad's favorite Bing Crosby album. It was a sensory overload of nostalgia, so powerful it was physically painful. I shifted the gifts in my arms, squared my shoulders, and rang the doorbell. The laughter inside cut off abruptly. Heavy footsteps approached. The door swung open, and my brother, Mark, filled the frame. He was 2 years older, but in the harsh porch light, he looked 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him. He wore a starched shirt and a tie, already loosened at the collar. His face, which had once been a friendlier, rounder version of my own, was tight with a familiar, bored resentment. He looked at the pile of presents in my arms, then up at my face. His eyes, the same shade of brown as mine, did a slow, deliberate roll. It was a gesture he had perfected in high school, one designed to dismiss, to diminish, to erase. We don't want you here, he said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, which made the words even more brutal. They weren't yelled in anger. They were stated as fact. I felt the blood drain from my face. Behind him, through the warm doorway, the scene was a tableau of family life. The long dining table set with Mom's best china. The one with the little blue flowers she only used for holidays. The towering Christmas tree, covered in 30 years of mismatched ornaments. My entire family was there. Dad at the head of the table, his electric carving knife poised over the golden brown turkey. Mom, placing her crystal dish of cranberry sauce on the table. Sarah helping little Emma with her napkin. My grandmother, Dorothy, in her usual chair, her silver hair shining. My aunt and uncle raising their wine glasses. They were all frozen, watching me. Go ruin someone else's holiday, Mark added, his voice flat and final. My throat closed up. The carefully rehearsed conversation starters, the anecdotes about my life in Seattle, they all turned to ash in my mouth. All I could manage was a choked whisper. Got it. Mark's expression didn't soften with pity or flicker with regret. He just stared at me, his hand tightening on the doorknob, his body language a solid wall. He was waiting for me to turn and leave. He held my gaze for another 3, 4, 5 seconds, an eternity of silent rejection. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he closed the heavy oak door in my face. The decisive click of the latch echoed in the cold, silent night. It was the sound of my last hope dying. I stood on that porch for what felt like a lifetime, the brightly wrapped gifts still clutched in my arms. The snow was falling faster now, melting on my hot cheeks. Through the wood of the door, I could hear the sound of a chair scraping, then my father's voice, low and angry, the sounds of life resuming without me. I was an interruption, a brief, unpleasant moment that was already over. Slowly, I turned around. The walk back to the rental car was a walk of shame. Every window of my childhood home seemed like an eye watching my retreat. I imagined them all sitting back down, my mother smoothing the tablecloth, Mark taking a triumphant gulp of wine. Problem solved. I opened the passenger door and didn't so much place the gifts on the seat as let them fall in a heap. The cheerful red and green paper seemed to mock me. I got behind the wheel and just sat there, my hands frozen on the steering wheel. The engine was off. The world outside was silent except for the gentle hiss of the snow. A single hot tear slid down my cheek. Then another. And then the dam broke. It wasn't loud, dramatic crying. It was a silent, gut-wrenching grief that shook my entire frame. It was the accumulated pain of 1,000 tiny cuts. The forgotten birthdays, the unanswered texts, the phone calls where I would share a small victory from work, only to be met with a lukewarm, "Oh, that's nice, dear." Before my mother changed the subject to Mark's latest success with the local hardware store, it was the profound, soul-deep loneliness of realizing that the people who are biologically programmed to be your anchor are, in fact, the ones setting you adrift. I replayed the scene at the door over and over. Mark's sneer, the blank faces of my family, the click of the lock. Had anyone defended me? Had my father said a word? Had my mother, who preached the importance of family above all else, made any move to stop him? The silence from inside the house was my answer. I don't know how long I sat there, stewing in a toxic brew of humiliation and sorrow. Could have been 10 minutes or 30. My breath had fogged up all the windows, creating a small, miserable cocoon. I was just about to summon the energy to put the key in the ignition and find the nearest bleak-looking motel when a frantic movement caught my eye. The front door of the house flew open. My father, Robert, came stumbling out. He wasn't wearing a coat, just his Christmas sweater, and he was moving with a clumsy urgency, his dress shoes slipping in the accumulating snow. "Jason! Jason, wait!" His voice was ragged, cutting through the quiet night. He reached the driver's side window and knocked, not gently, but with a series of urgent raps. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a regret that was about 10 minutes too late. I took a deep, shuddering breath, wiped my face on my sleeve, and rolled the window down an inch. The frigid air felt like a slap. I refused to look at him, keeping my eyes fixed on the fogged-up windshield. "Son, please," he pleaded, bending down to try and see my face. "Don't go. Please come back inside." What Mark did, there's no excuse for it. None. "Seems like he had everyone's approval," I said, my voice flat and dead. "No, that's not true," he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. Everyone was just shocked. It happened so fast. It didn't look like shock, Dad. It looked like a normal Tuesday. He let out a long, pained sigh, the sound a cloud of white in the cold air. Look, he's not himself, Jason. He's under a lot of pressure. It's not an excuse, but it's a reason. I'm tired of the reasons, Dad, I said, finally turning to look at him. I'm tired of the excuses that are always made for him and never for me. The store is failing, he blurted out, the words tumbling out in a rush. Williams Hardware is on the verge of going under. He's had to lay off people who've worked for us for decades. Dave Henderson, you remember Dave? Mark had to let him go last month. He said it was the worst day of his life. He and Sarah had to sell their house. They're in a small rental over on Maple Street, the one with the peeling paint. He's been trying to hide it from everyone, especially from you. This was new information. In the carefully curated family newsletter I received via my mother's phone calls, Mark was a pillar of the community, the successful son who had taken over the family legacy. Why would he hide it from me? Pride, son, Dad said sadly, and jealousy. He's been applying for regional manager jobs, anything to get out from under the debt. He sent out over 50 resumes. He got 2 interviews and no offers. He feels like a failure. And then he heard you were coming home. The son with the big shot marketing career in Seattle, the one who made it out. I think seeing you tonight was just too much for him to handle. The story was heartbreaking, and a small part of me felt a pang of sympathy for my brother. But it was overshadowed by the years of my own hurt. So because his life is hard, he gets to treat me like garbage? No, Dad said, shaking his head. It's not right, and I promise you he will apologize. I will drag him out here by his ear if I have to. But please, Jason, don't drive away. Don't let him have that power. Don't let him push you away from the rest of us. Your grandmother has been asking about you all week. Please, come inside. For me. His plea was desperate. He looked so old and tired. A man caught between 2 sons, trying to hold together a family that had been fracturing for years. Against my better judgment, I felt my resolve beginning to crack. Maybe he was right. Maybe driving away would be letting Mark win. With a heavy sigh, I cut the engine. I grabbed the stupid presents from the passenger seat. As I followed my father's retreating back toward the house, I felt like a soldier heading back into a battle I had already lost. The second entry was worse than the first. My mother, Patricia, stood in the entryway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her face was a mask of strained politeness. Jason, she said, her voice clipped, we've kept a plate warm for you. She didn't say, I'm so sorry, or, I'm glad you came back. Her eyes flicked down to my feet. Wipe your boots on the mat. You're dripping all over the floor. I bit back a retort and did as I was told, feeling like I was 10 years old again. As I walked into the dining room, a wave of suffocating silence fell over the table. All eyes were on me. It was a zoo, and I was the strange new animal being put on display. Then, a voice warm and strong broke the spell. Jason, my darling boy, get over here and give your grandmother a hug. Grandma Dorothy was already on her feet, her arms open wide. I went to her, burying my face in her soft, lavender-scented sweater. She was the only safe harbor in this storm. It's so good to see you, Grandma, I mumbled into her shoulder. You too, dear, she whispered back, patting my back firmly. Don't you let them get to you. Dad showed me to my seat, placed strategically between my grandmother and my aunt, as far from Mark as physically possible. Mark sat at the other end of the table, staring holes into his mashed potatoes. He refused to look at me. Sarah, his wife, gave me a quick, apologetic glance before focusing intently on cutting her food into tiny, precise pieces. The meal was an agonizing symphony of clinking silverware and forced small talk. Every attempt at conversation was a minefield. So, Jason, my Uncle Thomas bellowed, trying to be cheerful, I hear you're working with computers out there in Seattle, making those apps. It's a marketing agency, Uncle Thomas, I said, forcing a smile. We help companies build their brands online. Oh, marketing, my mother said, her tone implying it was something frivolous, like finger painting. I suppose that's interesting. Mark has been so busy with real, tangible things. The hardware store is a cornerstone of this community, you know? The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. Dad, trying to help, jumped in. Jason's company just landed a huge new client, Westbrook Hotels. It's a very big deal. Right, son? It was a team effort, I mumbled. Sarah looked up, her first real sign of engagement all night. Westbrook? Wow, Jason. That's a huge name. Congratulations. The simple, honest praise was like a drop of poison in Mark's ear. He slammed his wine glass down on the table, making everyone jump. Well, not all of us can spend our days making fancy PowerPoints, he sneered. Some of us have to work with our hands, manage inventory, deal with payroll, run a real business. The attack was so direct, so pathetic, that I didn't even know how to respond. The air crackled with tension. My father opened his mouth to reprimand him. But just then, the doorbell rang, saving us all. Everyone at the table looked up, a collective frown of confusion on their faces. Expecting more family was out of the question. The entire Pinewood Williams clan was already seated. A neighbor dropping by with a fruitcake on Christmas night? Unlikely. I'll get it, Dad said, seizing the opportunity to escape the suffocating atmosphere. His chair scraped against the floor as he pushed himself away from the table. We listened to his footsteps fade down the hall, followed by the sound of the front door opening and a low, indistinct murmur of voices. The conversation at the table didn't resume. We all just sat there in a state of suspended animation, waiting to see what new drama was about to walk into our lives. Mark took another long, defiant gulp of wine, his eyes fixed on me with a look of pure loathing. He clearly thought I had arranged this interruption somehow, just to spite him. A moment later, Dad reappeared in the dining room doorway, and he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a young man who looked like he had stepped directly out of a fashion magazine and into our humble Michigan home. He was Asian American, with sharp, intelligent eyes, a perfectly tailored coat dusted with fresh snow, and an air of kinetic energy that seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. My fork clattered onto my plate. "Michael," I said, my voice a stunned squeak. "What on earth are you doing here?" It was Michael Chin, my closest colleague at Anderson Digital. My work life and my family life were two separate planets that had never, ever been meant to collide. Seeing him standing there felt like a bizarre fever dream. Michael offered a winning, apologetic smile to the room of gawking faces. "Jason, man, I am so sorry about this. I know this is the worst possible time." He spoke with a crisp, confident cadence that was the polar opposite of our family's Midwestern drawl. "I tried calling your cell about a dozen times, but it went straight to voicemail." I fumbled for my phone in my pocket. The screen was dark. The long drive and my failure to pack a car charger had done it in. "There's a situation with the Westbrook account," Michael said, his expression turning serious. He wasn't just my colleague. He was the project manager for the Westbrook launch, the guy who kept all the trains running on time. "It's an emergency. A real one." "An emergency? What happened?" I asked, already feeling my blood pressure rise. "A competitor, Northwood Group, just submitted a hostile counteroffer to the Westbrook board. They're trying to poach the account right now, tonight. It's ugly. They're undercutting our pricing and promising a faster launch, which we know they can't deliver. The Westbrook board is getting cold feet. Our CEO, Mr. Anderson, he's in panic mode. He sent me personally. He wants us to draft a strategic response, a counterproposal, and get it to their VP, Elizabeth Westbrook, before she wakes up tomorrow morning. I was already in Detroit visiting my parents, so he figured it was the fastest way to get face-to-face with you. The string of words, emergency, hostile counteroffer, CEO, sent me personally, landed on the dinner table like a series of small explosions. My family just stared, their minds visibly struggling to compute the scale of this. This wasn't just website stuff. This was a corporate dogfight. My mother was the first to recover, her hostess instincts kicking in. "Well, for heaven's sake," she said, bustling to her feet. "Don't just stand there in the doorway getting cold. Come in, come in. Let me get you a plate. You must be starving." "Thank you, Mrs. Williams. I appreciate that," Michael said smoothly, shrugging off his expensive coat. Dad took it from him as if it were a sacred relic. As Michael sat down in the chair my mother had hastily pulled up, he added, almost as an afterthought, "The Westbrook deal is worth about $4.5 million in its first year. Jason's strategy is the heart of the entire proposal." Mr. Anderson said, and I quote, "I don't care where he is, get me Jason Williams. He's the only one who can kill this. $4.5 million. The number hung in the air, shimmering and obscene. My Uncle Thomas let out a low whistle. My mother, who was in the middle of spooning mashed potatoes onto a plate for Michael, froze mid-scoop. Sarah's eyes were wide as saucers. And Mark, my brother, looked like he had been gut-punched. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, sickly pallor. The hardware store he was so proud of, the one that was the cornerstone of the community, probably didn't see that kind of money in a decade. He was the king of a tiny, crumbling castle, and a dragon had just landed on his doorstep. The dynamic of the dinner was irrevocably altered. Michael, the stranger, became the center of attention. He was polite, charming, and utterly unfazed by the family tension. He answered my aunt's questions about his family in Detroit and praised my mother's cooking. But mostly he talked about work, about our work. He told the story of the Westbrook pitch, how we were the underdog against 3 larger agencies. Jason found this one tiny piece of data in their market research that everyone else had missed, Michael explained, gesturing with his fork. It completely changed our approach. He built the entire campaign around it. He stayed up for 48 hours straight before the final presentation, rebuilding the entire deck. When he presented it to the Westbrook board, they were blown away. It was brilliant. With every word of praise Michael offered, I could see Mark physically deflating in his chair. He was on his 4th glass of wine now, and his movements were getting sloppy. He was sullenly pushing his green beans around his plate, his resentment a palpable force field. In an attempt to bring the conversation back to a more family-friendly topic, my Aunt Margaret turned to me. "It must be nice living in such a big city, Jason. Tell me about your apartment." "It's small," I said with a laugh, "but it's mine. It has a tiny balcony that looks out over Puget Sound. On a clear day, you can see the mountains. It's my favorite spot." As I described it, I gestured with my hand, caught up in the memory. In doing so, I knocked my half-full glass of red wine. It toppled over in slow motion, spilling a dark, blood-red stain across my mother's pristine, cream-colored tablecloth. "Oh, God!" I gasped, jumping to my feet. "Mom, I am so sorry." I grabbed my napkin and started frantically blotting at the spreading stain, only making it worse. "Of course you are," Mark sighed loudly, the sound full of theatrical exasperation. He threw his own napkin down on the table. "Always making a mess. Always the center of attention. Some things never change, do they?" The cruelty of the remark silenced the room. It was so petty, so disproportionate to the accident, that it was breathtaking. "I'll get the club soda," Dad said quietly, his voice laced with shame for his son's behavior. But Michael was already up. "No worries. I've got this," he said cheerfully, heading for the kitchen. He came back with a salt shaker and a can of seltzer. As he leaned over to treat the stain, he whispered so that only I could hear, "Don't let him get to you. He's a classic insecure bully. Your success is like kryptonite to him." His quiet act of solidarity was a lifeline. But the evening was already ruined. The conversation fractured into small, awkward pockets. I felt like a pariah at my own family's table. I was just about to tell Michael we should probably get to a hotel and start working when Mark abruptly stood up. He tapped his glass with his spoon, the sharp clink, clink, clink demanding everyone's attention. A strange, almost manic smile was plastered on his face. "If I could have everyone's attention for just a moment," he announced, his voice a little too loud. "Sarah and I have some news." He draped a proprietary arm around his wife's shoulders. Sarah looked up at him, her smile strained. "We were going to wait," Mark continued, his eyes scanning the room, making a point of not looking at me. "But since the entire family is here, we wanted to share our joy with all the people who matter most." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "We're going to have another baby. Number 3 is on the way." The room erupted in a chorus of delighted squeals and congratulations. My mother burst into tears of joy. Dad rushed over to crush Mark in a hug. My grandmother clapped her hands. It was a tidal wave of familial bliss, and I was an island being swallowed by it. Mark wasn't finished. He raised his glass high, his eyes finally finding mine. They were gleaming with triumph. "We're so blessed," he declared, "to be building our family and our legacy right here, in Pinewood, surrounded by a real support system. I just couldn't imagine raising children anywhere else, away from their roots." My mother, beaming, squeezed his arm. "That's what life is really about, isn't it?" she added, her gaze flicking to me for a fraction of a second. "Being present, being there for the things that truly matter." That was it, the 1-2 punch. Mark's declaration of his superior life, and my mother's endorsement of it. It wasn't just an announcement. It was a verdict, a judgment on my life, my choices, my worth. And something inside me, something I had kept locked down and buried for my entire adult life, finally, irrevocably snapped. I placed my dessert fork on the plate with a quiet, deliberate click. The sound seemed to amplify in the suddenly charged atmosphere. I pushed my chair back from the table, the legs scraping softly against the hardwood floor, and I stood up. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, but a strange, cold calm washed over me. The years of swallowing my anger, of absorbing the subtle and not-so-subtle barbs, of making myself smaller to make them more comfortable. It was all over. The reservoir of my patience had run dry. "Congratulations, Mark, Sarah," I said, my voice even and steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside me. "A new baby is a wonderful thing. I'm truly happy for you." The room remained quiet. The celebratory mood had evaporated, replaced by a tense, wary anticipation. They could all sense it. The tectonic plates of our family's dynamic were grinding against each other, about to shift. My father's smile was gone, replaced by a look of deep unease. "Jason," he started, a warning in his tone. "It's okay, Dad," I said, holding up a hand. "I'm not going to make a scene." I let my eyes travel around the table, meeting the gaze of each family member. But since Mark mentioned the importance of sharing things with the people who matter most, I think it's time I was finally honest, too. My mother's face tightened. "Jason, this is not the time or the place," she said, her voice a low hiss. "You are not going to ruin your brother's happy moment." A short, humorless laugh escaped my lips. "Ruin it? Mom, with all due respect, what do you think has been happening all night? What do you think has been happening for the last 10 years? Mark scoffed from the other end of the table, crossing his arms over his chest in a posture of defensive arrogance. "Oh, here we go," he sneered. "Saint Jason is about to give a sermon. Everyone get ready to hear about how we've all wronged him." "No sermon, Mark," I said, turning my full attention to him. The calm I felt was unnerving, even to me. It was the calm of a man with nothing left to lose. "No speech, just a little bit of truth. You might want to sit down for it." Ignoring my mother's furious glare, I began. "For 3 years, I've done everything I can to remain a part of this family from 2,000 miles away. I call on birthdays. I send Christmas gifts, presents for the kids, flowers on Mother's Day. I have a standing invitation for any of you to come out to Seattle, to see my home, to be a part of my life. An invitation that has been met with a resounding silence." I looked at my aunt and uncle, who were now staring intently at the floral pattern on their plates. I've sat quietly and listened while my life choices have been dissected and criticized. I've listened to hints that my job is frivolous, that my life is lonely, that my success isn't real success because it's not happening here, in Pinewood, under your watchful eyes. Jason, you are exaggerating. My mother cut in, her cheeks flushed with angry red blotches. Am I? I fired back, my voice rising, the calm finally cracking. Am I exaggerating that tonight, on Christmas, I showed up at the door of my childhood home, with gifts in my arms, only to be told by my own brother that I wasn't wanted here? In front of all of you? And what did you do? What did any of you do? Nothing. You just sat there and watched. My gaze landed on my father. He flinched, his face etched with shame. Dad, I know you love me. I know you try to be the peacemaker. But being a peacemaker isn't the same as being a father. A father is supposed to protect his kids. All of them. And you have stood by and let this happen. You've allowed Mark to treat me this way for years, because you hate confrontation more than you hate the fact that your family is broken. He looked like I had physically struck him. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. I turned to my mother. And you, Mom, you talk about family being the most important thing. But what you mean is your idea of family. A family where everyone stays put, where everyone follows the rules. My accomplishments, my life, they will never be good enough for you, not because they're not impressive, but because they are mine. They are not the choices you would have made for me. And my independence, it feels like a rejection to you. A judgment on your own life. Finally, I turned back to Mark. He was no longer sneering. He was staring at me, his face a mask of stunned shock. He was a bully who had just had his victim punch back. Hard. And you? I said, my voice dropping to a low, intense level that cut through the silence. This has never been about me abandoning the family. This has always been about your own fear. You've been pushing me away since we were kids. Since the day I realized I wanted a different life than the one that was laid out for me. You couldn't stand the thought that I might succeed at something you never even had the courage to try. So you built this narrative in your head, the one where you're the dutiful son holding down the fort, and I'm the selfish traitor who ran away. It's a convenient story, Mark. But we both know it's a lie. The silence that descended on the room was profound and absolute. It was the silence of a truth that had been held underwater for years and had finally, violently, burst to the surface. I stood there, my body trembling with the sheer force of it all, my heart pounding in my ears. I had said it all. I had detonated the bomb that had been ticking at the center of our family for my entire life. Now I just had to wait for the fallout. The silence in the dining room was a living thing. It was thick with shock and decades of unspoken resentments. My words hung in the air, iridescent and poisonous. I saw my Aunt Margaret exchange a wide-eyed, horrified glance with my uncle. My father looked down at his hands on the table as if he'd never seen them before. My mother's face was a stony mask of indignation. Then, a voice, thin as paper but as strong as wire, sliced through the quiet. The boy is right. Every head in the room swiveled to my grandmother. Dorothy sat ramrod straight in her chair. Her 92-year-old eyes, usually clouded with age, were now blazing with a fierce, lucid clarity. She fixed her gaze first on my parents, then on Mark. I have sat at this table for 40 years and watched this poison spread, she said, her voice shaking with an emotion I had never heard from her before, anger. I have watched you praise one son for following the path you laid for him, and punish the other for the crime of wanting his own life. I held my tongue because I was raised to believe that a woman's job is to keep the peace. But I am 92 years old, and I am done keeping a peace that doesn't exist. She looked directly at Mark, her expression withering. He did not abandon this family, Mark. He escaped it. There is a difference. Mark, finally jolted out of his stupor, shot back, his voice cracking with disbelief and rage. What do you know, Grandma? You're old. You don't know anything about the real world, about the pressure I'm under. I know a bully when I see one, she retorted without missing a beat. And I know a man who is so terrified of his own shadow that he has to extinguish his brother's light to feel tall. It was at that precise moment that Michael Chun, who had been a silent, deeply uncomfortable spectator to this family implosion, decided he could be silent no longer. He pushed his chair back, the sound scraping loudly in the tense room, and stood up. Excuse me, he said, his voice polite but edged with steel. I know this is a private family matter, and I truly apologize for interjecting, but I cannot sit here and listen to this any longer. He looked from Mark to my parents, his eyes filled with a kind of professional pity. You have no idea who you are talking to. He gestured toward me. You're treating him like he's a disappointment, a child who ran away from his responsibilities. You're dismissing his career as website stuff. Michael shook his head slowly, a small, incredulous smile on his face. Let me tell you who you're talking to. He paused, commanding the attention of the entire room. You're talking to the man our CEO calls his secret weapon. You're talking to the strategist who the vice president of Westbrook Hotels, a woman who has been in the industry for 30 years and eats marketing agencies for breakfast, called a once-in-a-generation talent. He let the words land. My mother's jaw went slack. This $4.5 million contract you find so frivolous, Michael continued, his voice rising with passion, is currently the single most important project at our firm. And as I told you, it is on the verge of collapsing. A competitor is trying to steal it, and our CEO is in full-blown panic mode. And the only person he trusts to save it, the only person with the strategic mind to outmaneuver the piranhas at Northwood Group, is your son. He pointed a finger directly at me, his hand steady. That is why I am here. Mr. Anderson didn't send me for a signature. He put me on a plane on Christmas Eve during a blizzard and told me, go find Jason Williams. I don't care if he's at the North Pole. Get him on the phone, get him on a laptop, get him whatever he needs, because he is the only person who can fix this. The power in the room had not just shifted. It had undergone a seismic, violent reversal. The foundation of my family's worldview, the one where Mark was the competent, successful heir and I was the flighty, irresponsible runaway, crumbled into dust in a matter of seconds. Mark was staring at me, his face ashen. The smugness, the anger, the resentment. It was all gone, replaced by a hollow, gaping shock. He wasn't looking at his little brother. He was looking at a man he didn't know at all, a powerful and respected stranger that he had just tried and failed to humiliate. Michael wasn't finished. He turned to me, his voice softening, speaking to me as if we were the only two people in the room. Jason, Elizabeth Westbrook, the VP, she also told me to give you a message. She said this whole crisis just proves her point, that you're wasted at our agency. He took a breath. She wants you to come work for her. At Westbrook, she's creating a new position for you, Director of Global Marketing Strategy. What? The word escaped my lips as a dry, voiceless whisper. It's a massive opportunity, Michael said, a proud smile finally breaking through his serious demeanor. A huge step up. Double your salary, corner office, the whole package. She wants you to lead their entire global brand. And Jason, he paused for effect. The corporate headquarters. They're in Detroit. Detroit. The word landed in the center of the dining room table like a meteorite. Not some impossibly distant, glamorous city they could continue to resent. Detroit, an hour's drive from where they all sat. Close enough to be undeniable. Close enough to be a choice. It was more than a job offer. It was a checkmate. It was an invitation to return, but not as the prodigal son, crawling back in defeat. It was an invitation to return as a king. The decision is yours, man, Michael said quietly. They need you. They want you. I looked around the room at the gallery of stunned faces. My father's eyes were filled with tears, a mixture of pride and a terrible, dawning regret. My mother simply stared at me, her hand covering her mouth as she whispered, So, you could come home? The question was a confession of how badly she had misjudged me, misunderstood me, underestimated me. I looked at Mark. The blood had drained from his face, leaving him looking ghostly and shrunken in his chair. He looked at me, then at the wreckage of his dinner, then at the half-empty bottle of wine. His carefully constructed world had been shattered. He was no longer the golden child. He was just a man who had been cruel to his brother and had been exposed as a fool. Without a word, he pushed his chair back, the legs screeching against the floor. He stood up, turned, and walked out of the room. A moment later, the slam of the back door reverberated through the silent house. It was the sound of a final, bitter surrender. The slam of the door was a punctuation mark on the evening's chaos, leaving a ringing, unnerving silence in its place. For a moment, nobody breathed. The storm had passed, leaving behind the wreckage. I should have felt a surge of victory, a satisfying sense of justice served. Instead, a hollow ache spread through my chest. The man who had just fled wasn't just my antagonist. He was my brother. Sarah, Mark's wife, made a hesitant move to stand. I should go check on him. But before she could, my mother, Patricia, found her voice. And it wasn't a voice of contrition or understanding. It was a voice shaking with a last, desperate surge of defensive fury. She rounded on me, her eyes, which a moment ago had been wide with shock, now narrowed into slits of blame. "Are you happy now?" she hissed, the words sharp and venomous. "Is this what you wanted, Jason? To come back here, wave your success around like a trophy, and completely humiliate your brother? To shatter your own family on Christmas?" The accusation was so wildly illogical, so completely divorced from the reality of what had just transpired, that I was momentarily struck dumb. She was desperately trying to cling to the old narrative, the one where I was the agent of chaos and Mark was the steady, wronged son. It was her brain's last-ditch effort to avoid confronting the truth, that she had backed the wrong horse, that she had nurtured the very dysfunction that had just blown up in her face. "Patricia, that is enough," my father said, and for the first time all night, his voice held a core of genuine authority. The peacemaker had finally left the building. "No, it is not enough, Robert," she shot back, turning her fury on him. "You don't understand. He has no idea what it's been like for Mark, the sacrifices he has made for this family, for your business. He is the one who stayed, the one who shouldered the responsibility while his brother was off living a consequence-free life on the other side of the country. That's a lie." The words were spoken quietly, but they cut through my mother's tirade like a surgeon's scalpel. We all turned to Sarah. She was still seated, her hands clenched into white-knuckled fists in her lap. Her face was pale and tear-streaked, but her eyes held a new, steely resolve. The supportive wife had finally reached her breaking point. "That's a complete lie," she repeated, her voice stronger now. She looked from my mother to my father and then to me. "You want to talk about reality? Let me tell you about reality." She took a ragged breath. "Mark hasn't been shouldering anything. He's been crushed by it. The store is drowning in debt. He's been working until midnight 6 nights a week for over a year, trying to plug holes in a sinking ship. I have found him asleep at the kitchen table with his head in his hands more times than I can count. I've listened to him have panic attacks in the middle of the night, terrified that he's going to lose the legacy you handed him. Dad." The ugly, hidden truths came spilling out, one after another. "He didn't sell our dream house to downsize. He sold it because the bank sent a foreclosure notice. The 50 job applications? It was closer to 100. And he didn't just get rejected, he was ghosted. No one wants a 30-year-old manager from a failing small-town hardware store. His pride wouldn't let him tell anyone. He felt like he was failing all of you." She finally turned her gaze to me, her eyes filled with a complex mixture of apology and anger. "And every time you called, Jason, with news about some new success, it was like a knife twisting in his gut. He was proud of you on some level, I know he was, but mostly he was consumed by envy, because you got out. You built something of your own, and it was succeeding while the thing he was given was falling apart. So he did the only thing he could to feel like he still had some power over you. He hurt you. He shut you out." Her final words were for my mother. "And you encouraged him," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Every time you praised him for being the dutiful son and criticized Jason for leaving, you fed the worst parts of him. You turned your sons' lives into a competition. So don't you dare stand there and blame Jason for what happened tonight. We are all responsible for this mess." The truth, raw and unvarnished, silenced the room. My mother sank into her chair, the fight completely gone, leaving only a gray, empty shock. Michael, who had been a silent witness to this final confession, cleared his throat. I should probably go, he said, moving toward the door. I'll book a hotel. Jason, call me in the morning. We'll figure out a game plan for Westbrook. I just nodded, unable to form words. Yeah, thanks, Michael, for everything. He gave my shoulder a quick squeeze and was gone, leaving us alone with the wreckage. I stood up. I'm going to talk to him. Jason, maybe you should give him some space, Sarah said, her voice weary. I shook my head. We've been giving each other space for 15 years. Look where it's gotten us. The garage was cold and dark, smelling of oil and old regrets. I found Mark sitting on the edge of the workbench, next to a rusty toolbox. He was hunched over, a half-empty bottle of whiskey dangling from his hand. He didn't look up as I approached. If you came out here to tell me what a pathetic loser I am, you can save your breath, he muttered to the concrete floor. No, I said, my voice quiet. I pulled up an old wooden stool and sat across from him. I came to tell you I know what that feels like. He snorted, a harsh, humorless sound. Right? Mr. Director of Global Marketing knows what it feels like to be a failure. My second year in Seattle, I said, ignoring his sarcasm. I was put in charge of a project for a big tech client, my first real lead. I screwed it up, royally. I misunderstood the client's brief. I was too arrogant to ask for help, and the whole thing went off the rails. We lost the account. Mark looked up, a flicker of genuine surprise in his bloodshot eyes. My boss called me into his office, I continued. He told me that I was a talented strategist, but that I was a terrible leader and that I had let my ego get in the way of the work. He told me I had one more chance, and if I blew it, I was fired. I went home to my empty apartment that night, and I was so terrified, so humiliated, I didn't leave for 3 days. I just ordered pizza and drank cheap beer, and thought about packing my car and driving back here in disgrace. I looked him straight in the eye. So yeah, Mark, I know exactly what it feels like to be a failure. We sat in silence for a long time. The only sound was the hum of the old chest freezer. You never told us, he said finally, his voice small. You never asked, I replied, not unkindly. We stopped talking to each other a long time ago, Mark. We just started talking at each other. He sighed, a long, rattling breath, and took another swig of whiskey. I'm sorry, Jay, he whispered. The words so quiet I almost didn't hear them. For tonight. For all of it. I'm sorry. I'm sorry too, I said. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, it felt like I was finally talking to my brother again. 1 year later, the drive north from Detroit to Pinewood no longer felt like a journey into a hostile past. It just felt like going home. The landscape was the same, flat and snow-covered, but my perspective had changed. It wasn't about escaping or enduring anymore. It was about showing up. I pulled into the driveway of my parents' house. The big wreath was on the door, but this year I noticed the red velvet bow wasn't faded. Someone had replaced it. A small detail, but it spoke volumes. I rang the bell, and the door was thrown open by my father, who was wearing a bright green sweater with a cartoon reindeer on it. He's here, he yelled over his shoulder, before pulling me into a hug that was no longer tentative or fraught with anxiety, but simply warm and strong. The house smelled of roasting turkey and fresh-baked bread. My niece and nephew, Emma and Noah, who now treated me not as a stranger but as their favorite uncle, came barreling into me, demanding to be picked up. Over my dad's shoulder, I saw the updated gallery of photos on the mantel. There was a goofy selfie of me and Mark at a Tigers game last summer. There was a professional portrait of the whole family, including Sarah holding my new nephew, Benjamin, with everyone actually smiling at the same time. And, front and center, was a framed photo of me, Mark, and Dad, standing in front of the gleaming new sign for Williams & Sons Hardware and Home Design. That first year was a tightrope walk over a canyon. It was the hardest, messiest, and most rewarding work I had ever done. I had taken the job in Detroit, My first act as director of global marketing was to negotiate a remote work arrangement for 1 day a week. Every Friday, I drove to Pinewood. My first official act as an investor in the family business, using a large chunk of my signing bonus, was to call a family meeting at the kitchen table. It wasn't a meeting about forgiveness. It was a meeting about survival. I laid out the store's financials, the ugly truth of them, on the table. Then I laid out my plan. Complete rebrand, a new, modern inventory system, an e-commerce website, home design and installation services to compete with the big box stores. Mark resisted. Every step of the way, he fought me. It wasn't malice anymore. It was fear. He was a man who had been captain of a sinking ship for so long that he didn't trust a rescue boat. Our business meetings often devolved into shouting matches. But the difference was, after the shouting, we would sit in exhausted silence, and then, slowly, we would start talking again. We would find a compromise. We were, for the first time, learning how to have a productive fight. The real battlefield, however, was in a quiet, beige-colored office in a neighboring town every other Tuesday evening. Dr. Levinson's office. Family therapy. Those sessions were excruciating. They were a slow, painful lancing of a wound that had been festering for 30 years. We dredged up every old hurt, every perceived slight, every misunderstanding. We learned a new vocabulary, words like boundaries, validation, and unspoken expectations. My mother struggled the most. She was from a generation that didn't air its dirty laundry. She saw therapy as a sign of failure. For months, she was defensive, tearful, and resistant. The turning point came during a session in late spring. Dr. Levinson was asking her about her own childhood, and my mother was giving clipped, one-word answers. Then my father, in a moment of quiet courage, reached over and took her hand. "Tell them about the gallery, honey," he said softly. "Tell them about Chicago." And so she did. Through tears, she told the story of her dream job, the life she had imagined for herself in a big city, surrounded by art and culture. She talked about the fear that had kept her in Pinewood, the fear of failure, the fear of leaving the only world she had ever known. "I wasn't angry at you for leaving Jason," she said to me, her voice thick with a regret that was almost tangible. "I was envious of your courage. You were doing the one thing I was always too afraid to do. And every time you succeeded, it felt like a judgment on the choice I made. It was easier to call you selfish than it was to admit I had been a coward. It was a terrible thing to do to you, and I am so sorry." In that moment, I didn't see the critical, disapproving mother I had known my whole life. I just saw a woman, full of her own quiet sorrows and unfulfilled dreams, who had done the best she could with the tools she had. And I understood. It didn't erase the hurt, but it made space for forgiveness. Now, a year later, as we all sat down for Christmas dinner, the ghosts were gone. The air wasn't thick with tension. It was light with laughter. Mark and I fell into an easy rhythm, carving the turkey together. Sarah was showing my mom pictures of the baby on her phone, and they were both laughing. When it was time for a toast, Mark stood up. He looked around the table, his eyes clear and steady. "A year ago," he began, "this dinner was the worst night of my life. I was angry, I was bitter, and I was terrified. Today, I'm just grateful." He raised his glass. "I want to make a toast to second chances, and to my brother, Jason." He looked at me, a genuine, unforced smile on his face, who came home and, instead of walking away from the mess he found, decided to stay and help us clean it up. He taught me that family isn't about keeping score. It's about showing up, even when it's hard. He looked around at all of us. To family, the real, messy, work-in-progress kind. "I love you all." As we all raised our glasses, a chorus of "I love yous" echoing around the room, I caught my grandmother's eye. She smiled at me, a slow, satisfied smile, and gave me a little wink. It was a wink that said, "See, I told you so." And for the first time in my own home, I felt completely and utterly seen. The remnants of the feast were cleared away. The kids were in the living room, mesmerized by a Christmas movie, and a comfortable quiet had settled over the house. I found Mark in the kitchen, carefully loading the dishwasher with an efficiency I'd never seen him display before. It was one of the many small changes in him that year. He had started to take ownership of the small, domestic tasks he'd always considered Sarah's job. I leaned against the counter, nursing a cup of coffee. "That was a good toast," I said. He smiled without looking up from his task. Felt good to say it. He closed the dishwasher door and leaned against the opposite counter, facing me. "You know, that new supplier for the composite decking you found? Their margins are way better than our old guys. I think we can run a pretty aggressive spring sale and still come out ahead." "I was thinking the same thing," I said. "We could bundle it with an installation package. I can work up some ad copy for the local paper and a social media campaign." "Sounds good," he said. "Let's talk about it on Friday." It was that easy now. A year ago, a similar conversation would have been a week-long negotiation, fraught with his skepticism and my frustration. Now it was a partnership. We were a team. He was quiet for a moment, his expression turning more reflective. "You know," he said, "the night you came home, that night, after you and I talked in the garage, I went back inside. Mom and Dad were just sitting there in the living room, not talking. It was awful. I told them I was sorry, that I had been a complete jackass. And my dad, he just looked at me and said, 'Yes, you were, but we let you be. And that's our fault.' It was the first time I'd ever heard him admit he'd made a mistake. He told me once that he hated confrontation," I said. "He's getting better at it," Mark said with a wry smile. "Dr. Levinson is earning her money. That's for sure." He shook his head. "It's just strange to feel like we're all learning how to be a family at 40 and 60 and 90 years old." "Better late than never," I said. "Yeah," he said, his gaze drifting toward the living room, where the sound of our nieces and nephews laughing could be heard. "Better late than never." He looked back at me, his expression earnest. "Thank you, Jay. Really, you didn't have to do any of this. You could have taken that job and never looked back. No one would have blamed you." "I would have blamed me," I said honestly. "For a long time, I thought success meant getting as far away from here as possible. I thought it meant proving I didn't need any of you. But that night, standing there in the dining room with Michael talking about this huge job offer, I realized something. All the success in the world doesn't mean anything if you don't have people to share it with. And for better or for worse, you guys are my people. My home wasn't a place on a map anymore. It wasn't Pinewood or Seattle. It was the quiet respect in my brother's eyes. It was my mother asking about my work and actually listening to the answer. It was my father's easy, proud hug. It was the messy, complicated, frustrating, and beautiful reality of belonging to each other. We had torn our family down to the studs, and we were slowly, painstakingly, building it back up, stronger and more honest than it had ever been before. And that was a foundation that could withstand any storm. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it touched you in some way. It took a long time to get to a place of healing, and the journey is never really over, is it? We're all just a work in progress. Have you ever had a moment that changed your family dynamic forever, for better or for worse? That one conversation, that one event that drew a line in the sand? Share your story in the comments below. I read them all, and I think we can all learn from each other. And if you found some value in this, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss what's next.